Today is January 16th, 2015. We're doing an oral history interview for the archives at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. I'm Charles Lundquist. Our guest today is Ruth von Saurma. Ruth, thank you for being here, and we're very happy to have you. We usually start out by letting the interviewee tell a little bit about where they were born and educated and their early life, and then we'll get on to their to your career history. This is a little different today in that you also want to talk about the history of your late husband, so that we're sort of doing a double header today.
Well, actually, I only want to talk about my late husband today, and I prepared some material and collected a few things about his life.
All right.
So
let's start with him then.
Fine, very good, Pat. Well, my husband was born in 1908 in Dachau, in the former province of Silesia in Germany, which later on became Polish territory and is now Polish territory. He already in his youth was very active in technology, and he was an enthusiastic and active private pilot and also a radio amateur, even before his enrollment in the Technical University at Breslau. He graduated with a master's degree in engineering in 1940, and then subsequently he was drafted in the Air Force, in the German Air Force, and he became active in the development and deployment of jet-assisted takeoff units for heavy fighter aircraft.
And JATO, I guess we call them in the U.S.
I see. Okay, very good. And he later on was assigned as technical director of the Air Force V2 Testing and Training Center in Sempin on the island of Usedom.
V2 or V1?
That was the V1.
V1, yes.
I'm sorry. But the V1 used the same, what would you call it?
Test range.
Test range over the Baltic Sea.
Right.
That the V2 actually used.
That's correct.
And he occasionally had met Werner von Braun, but he never worked with him. There was the same difference between the Army and the Air Force that we have had here in this country. And while he was in Sempin, he developed and realized the concept of a mobile launch platform for the V1, and also pursued some aerodynamic improvements for the of the wings of the V1, to increase their range. Well, in April 1945, as a lieutenant colonel in the German Air Force Engineering Corps, he was taken prisoner of war and was released from a prisoner of war camp in early 1947.
So he then was released from a prisoner of war camp.
Exactly.
Were you married at that time?
I was married, and actually I had joined the area of Peenemünde already in April 1944, immediately after my marriage to Fred in Paris, France, actually.
Okay. So you met him in France then, when you
Yeah.
You were working for Scania, were you?
I was working for a German company who did all sorts of aircraft and other instruments. So they did mechanical engineering on other items.
I know of Scania because the Scania cameras were used even in the United States for tracking missiles.
Oh, really?
So I knew of the Scania company that you
Well,
worked
I'm
for.
delighted. And actually, I was an employee of the subsidiary of Ascania in France, in Paris, called the, what did they call it? Ascania, I've forgotten now the
Okay,
name
but
of
it's a
it.
subsidiary, we
Yeah,
understand that.
that's right,
That's
okay.
fine.
And my parents had been bombed out. They lived in Berlin, but were bombed out in one of the very first air raids on Berlin. So after the war, none of us could go back to where we had lived before. And my late husband, you certainly could not go back into Silesia.
Yeah,
That was
certainly.
completely taken
Russian.
over by Russians.
Yes, certainly.
But I spent the last year of World War II, from 1944 until January 1945, in Peenemünde.
Working
and-
for this subsidiary of
Of the
Scania.
Ascania, exactly.
So
And it-
you were a Peenemünde worker on your own?
Well, at least I already became familiar, although everything was very secretive at that time.
What was your function for the company? What were you?
Well, at that time, I was just a secretary,
Okay.
while I had been a translator in Paris.
Uh-huh.
But,
But you were helping with the paperwork.
Oh, yeah,
And
exactly.
as we know from the space program, the paperwork is every bit as important as the hardware.
Well,
but-
you're kind to say that.
Well, no, it's true. I've experienced it myself, as you have.
Well, and of course, what was amazing, I became familiar even with the launching of the V2, because you couldn't miss hearing them.
Yeah, it'd be hard to miss, wouldn't it?
Exactly. And of course, the other day, I even heard that they considered the V1 a precursor of the drones.
Yeah.
That was
That's an
big.
interesting
Yeah.
observation.
Uh-huh.
It really is.
Because they could deliver something in the head of the missile,
Yeah.
and so I thought that was kind of interesting.
I think there was a U.S. rocket that the people that had worked on the V1 worked on in the U.S., not at White Sands, but out in California, called the Loon.
Uh-huh.
The Loon was the U.S. Counterpart of the V1 in the same way that Redstone was a sequel to the V2.
I see. Uh-huh.
And that was in California at Point Mugu.
I see. Well, I was not even aware of that.
All right.
Well, anyway, we were, after my husband was released from the prisoner of war camp, we were in Western Germany, which was very devastated at that time. And of course, the Allies did not allow any aircraft industry. They did not allow pilots to fly their own aircraft. They didn't allow any airlines, German airlines, to fly. And also, living conditions as a refugee were really terrible.
I'm sure that's right.
So, living
We
in,
hear that from everybody.
well, I can imagine, living in one room sometimes without, even running water or anything was something terrible. Well, while my husband, he started, after being released, he started a small enterprise to manufacture radios and loudspeakers, and later became a development engineer with Lurgi, a German company that did, among other things, electronic precipitators for German industrial companies in order to recover some of the chemical elements that came out of the
Out of the processing.
Well, he, in 1943, when he had another offer from the U.S. Department of Defense to come to the United States under the so-called Project Paperclip, and he was allowed to take his family with him, and even it was indicated that if things didn't work out as well as he thought, after 6 months we could return to Germany.
And that was in 1953.
That was in 1953. But under the condition that existed, we thought, and my husband thought, we'll give it a try. And so we moved first to New York. And it was in New York that we met Dr. von Brown.
Oh,
He did his very first, I would say, national television program.
oh really?
Yeah, and about a satellite, and he had heard about my husband being there. So after that program, he invited us to dinner at the St. Regis Hotel.
Oh, how nice.
Well, he was there at the expenses of CBS.
Well, why not? Yes, might as well.
And so he said, well, enjoy yourself.
Yes,
I mean,
good.
this is all, the TV is paying for it all.
That's fine.
So we had a delightful dinner, and even the next morning, and his wife Maria was with her.
Ah, very nice.
And I enjoyed meeting her. She was very charming and very unassuming, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And the next day, we drove out with them to Point West,
Mm-hmm.
West Point.
West Point, yes.
West Point, yeah. And it was a lovely evening, driving down the Hudson
Yes, that's a
Valley,
nice drive.
etc.
That's a pretty.
Well, anyway, the husbands talked about possibilities for my late husband, and we were really not only charmed, but very impressed by the personality of Von Brown.
Yeah, everybody was.
He truly was a genius and so well versed in so many things of interest, not only science, but also interested in arts, in music.
He composed some music himself, and at his 100th birthday celebration here at UAH, a person from the music department played the music he had written.
I remember well, and it was absolutely charming. And he was also interested in philosophy. So it really was his personality who drew us to Huntsville. And we thought, well, and Brown being from a very renowned family, and so was my husband, we thought if Werner and Maria von Brown could make it in Huntsville, maybe we could make it too.
Very good.
So in January 1954, we arrived in Huntsville. And actually, since I'm here really to talk about my late husband, I want to mention that that actually after the negotiations also with the personnel office of ABMA, he came here and he had various assignments at ABMA. He, in the beginning, was technical assistant of Von Brown, then also became chief of the weapons systems office at ABMA. And actually, he oversaw later on some of the development projects in the Saturn Systems office. Mm-hmm. But what was closest to his heart actually was an assignment to be the chief project engineer for the ambitious Dinosaur Project. And the Dinosaur Project was the project of a piloted spacecraft. It really was a kind of a forerunner of the shuttle.
Yeah, did he do that here in Huntsville, or did he go
Yeah,
elsewhere?
and he was at Boeing at one time and on the East Coast.
Okay.
Because
the Dinosaur program was mainly elsewhere. There might have been parts of it here in Huntsville.
well, he was just a project engineer, there was no manufacture or anything
Yes.
of the Dinosaur here in Huntsville.
No, no.
And it was just in the theoretical stage. But it was really close to his heart since he had been a private pilot, and he just didn't want to think himself of sitting on a rocket without being able
to fly it.
steer
Yeah, yes.
and fly it.
All of the
Yeah.
pilots feel that way.
You are so right. And so we also had a very good contact with the very first 7 astronauts.
Yes,
Because we were friends of Dr. Kuttner,
yes.
who was in charge of the very
Yeah, I knew
first
Kuttner.
group.
I got to the von Braun group also in '54.
Oh, really?
So
Well,
we-
you have seen it all, Ben.
Well, I've seen a lot of
Yeah,
it.
yeah, definitely. Well, but the Dinosaur Project was terminated and canceled in favor of the even more ambitious and expedient Saturn Apollo program, which I have forgotten. Was it in 1961? It was, or was 1962?
Yeah,
That-
the Saturn vehicle got going even before 1960, and the Apollo program was approved in '62, I believe.
Yeah, it could be.
62
Yeah.
or 3, somewhere thereabouts.
Well, actually, in addition to his technical project, Fred was often called assigned to present talks on rockets and spaceflight to various audiences, because in the 1950s, the concept of spaceflight and to fly in beyond the atmosphere was a completely novel idea that the public really couldn't imagine that it could happen. So occasionally he substituted for Dr. von Braun to, when Dr. von Braun was invited for some speeches and he had to cancel out because of various other assignments and also sometimes by the flu or whatever the reason was. And so,
Well, every now and then, the headquarters people wanted him when he had another appointment, so he had to go to the headquarters instead of giving his talk.
yeah, definitely. And also, it was very important to reach the general public because, after all, it was necessary to gain not only the public's interest, but also the public's support for further development of long-range missiles. So he substituted on several occasions for von Braun, and in addition, he, at the request of the St. Bernard's Abbey in Coleman, he became scientific advisor to the College of St. Bernard.
Really? I had not known that.
So,
That's an interesting fact to get into the history.
well, I think so many schools and colleges felt that something had been amiss in their scope of learning, and so they wanted some insight in what was at the forefront of technology.
Oh,
at
very
that
nice,
particular
very nice
time.
concept, very nice.
Well, also during his tenure with ABMA and MSFC Martha Center, Fred received various distinguished service awards, and he was issued a number of patents, one of which was for the development of a pilotless rocket-powered projectile for accurate cargo delivery. And I have the copy here of one of those patents.
Very good.
Not that we got any money for it,
Yeah.
but anyway, it showed his imagination and actually his technical expertise.
As I recall from reading about it, one of the most interesting parts was the almost like a autogyro reentry with rotating, self-propelled by falling by the atmosphere, rotating wings like a helicopter but without power.
Well, I'm delighted that you even know about that.
Yes,
aspect.
I knew about that.
Yeah. Well, in his leisure time in Alabama, Fred renewed his private pilot license, and he really enjoyed flying and enjoyed sailing on the Tennessee River. And
So he became very Americanized then.
well, I would say so.
Sounds like it.
And keeping contacts with radio amateurs in faraway places. In fact, with the help of a friend, he built a huge, what is it? It isn't an antenna or a receiver, a huge thing.
An antenna, I guess.
Yeah, an antenna. And we lived on Montesano at that time, so it had to be higher than all the mountains.
Oh, yes.
So that we would receive a signal.
Yes.
And, well, those were his pastimes. And before, actually, at the very last evening, he heard that von Braun wanted to assign him as a liaison person to NASA headquarters.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And that was, and he heard about it, we had a Christmas party that evening, and but never came true because he actually, very unexpectedly, he died in December 1961, and it was a great shock for his family, but also to his friends. It had been so unexpected.
Yeah.
And he had had his tests, his physicals for his private licenses in the summer before. So it was really, I still don't know to this day whether it was an embolie or what it was that brought his death. Anyway.
Sounds almost more like a stroke.
Could well be.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think.
Strokes are much harder to predict than heart trouble.
Well, we never had things tested, so I did not want to interfere.
No, that's
Yeah.
perfectly understandable.
Well, anyway, I think many of his friends at that time recalled really his engaging and really rather distinguished personality, and also his great sense of humor and a very bright intelligence. Well, most of all, of course, his passing was a serious and lasting loss for my daughter Lily, who was 16 years old at that time and already in a boarding school in Mississippi, and for myself. But we both cherish his memory with greatest fondness. And what helped me to get over this great loss was actually the fact that I had already started on a part-time basis to work with Dr. von Braun on some of his foreign correspondence, and this job originally as a translator later developed into a very intriguing thing. I became the International Public Relations Specialist at the Marshall Space Flight Center.
According to the Marshall Star newspaper, you began that work in 1958.
Exactly.
Under ABMA.
I started that immediately after the first satellite was launched.
Right.
And that was such a blessing for the entire Western world because, I think the American population had really been hurt and was disgusted that the Russians had been able to launch Sputnik as the very first thing to go into space. And so when finally the Huntsville team was allowed to launch a satellite, which they had prepared for
Yes.
already several months
Yeah, we
before.
originally had that on the schedule for January 1957.
Exactly. And it was so, well, disappointing to everyone here that the center had not gotten permission to launch that. But after the successful Explorer launch in January 58, von Braun got such a mass of congratulatory telegrams from all over the world, so many requests for interviews, for articles for publication, visitors who wanted to come here and talk to him. So they contacted me and asked me whether I would join the team originally as a translator. And I told them I was happy to do it if I could do it on a part-time basis.
So you had studied translation in college, as I remember.
That is correct, yeah.
And had a degree in such linguistics.
I had started to learn foreign languages and finished those courses in the letter house.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, in the beginning, I only worked from 8 to 2 o'clock because I wanted to be able to pick up my daughter from school.
Of course.
And we were able to take her to school in the morning, and then I had my own car and picked her up at 2 and could be together with her. But that job later on developed into a full-time and very intriguing things. But I thought that will be the subject of another time.
No, we need to go into a little of that now today, while we've got you here, if you don't mind.
Is there anything else you want to take a look or from the things that I collected for my
we may go down to the archives and copy a little of that if we.
Okay, well, that will be fine.
But we need to follow your career a little bit. You've explained that you were working with von Braun in the early days at Marshall, you first ABMA and then Marshall,
Exactly.
and as time went on, you undertook more and more responsibility, as I understand.
Well, and it was really quite a highlight for me to work for von Braun, and he really was remarkable. He gave you sometimes some assignments which you would never have tackled if on your own.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was really great when he asked you just to prepare a manuscript or just to write a letter, and you got it back with not very many corrections or no corrections at all. So, I mean, you felt on top of the world.
Yes,
Excellent.
yes.
And
You were in a very key position.
And I'll never forget, for the very first thing that I wrote for him at one time, he wrote on it, "I swallow it, hook, line, and sinker." So no correction whatsoever.
Okay.
Well,
He had learned American slang already.
well, he was remarkable
He was.
in his grasp of knowledge and of the language, of the politics
Yes.
that was involved. And of course we had a very bright director of public affairs, Gordon Harris.
Yes.
And
I knew
think
him, of course.
he steered him also into the right direction, that it was necessary to get the entire public involved, because if that were not the case, how would you ever get the, tax money
Right.
in order to pay for those outrageously expensive, huge rockets and possibly spacecraft?
Well, I remember one of his sayings. It was early to bed, early to rise, work like hell, and publicize.
Well, that
He
was
was
very true.
very true.
Yeah. And I still remember he had in his office a huge Saturn V rocket, and he had a little figure at the bottom
Yes.
of it which represented the taxpayer. So he never forgot that.
Mm-hmm.
And it was remarkable also how many speeches von Braun did. And of course, he also was delighted to write for articles for other countries, and of course, especially a good number of articles in German.
Surely.
And I was delighted to prepare some of the text, and he just said, well, you know the whole theme, so just put something down, and then we'll see how things work out. And also, after all his trips, for example, he made a trip to Tibet and to the South Pole.
Yeah, Antarctica.
And then when he came back, he would call me to his office and then relate some of the highlights of his trip, and then gave me some assignments to whom he had to write some thank you notes, you know. So, and I remember he was in Greece at one time, and the Queen of Greece asked him and invited him, and in that case, I simply had to prepare a little draft that he then put in his own handwriting. He felt he had to
write it
do
by hand.
it by hand, to write it by hand. This could not be done, you know, on a typewriter.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what also was great, we had so many foreign visitors who were intrigued by what was going on here and wanted to know. And I remember one of them in particular, it was Wolfgang von Saurma. He was the first person to fly around the world in a flying boat. And I mean, that was after Lindbergh had done his flight, and someone else done a regular flight around the world, but in a regular motor flight, and not in a flying boat that could only land on the water.
Yes.
And von Saurma came here, and of course he had, after that flight to the United States, he had a ticker tape parade in New York, and I mean, he was really kind of a world-known pilot, and later became, what was it? Attaché at the German embassy in Japan.
Oh, really?
And then, and he was, on the board of Lufthansa, the German airline,
Yes.
of course. So when he came here, von Braun had a lengthy interview, was delighted, you know, to
Sure.
get to know him. And I remember I took him to lunch in our officers' club.
Yes.
And I think it was, who was in charge of the research? Rudolf Herrmann.
Rudolf Herrmann, yeah.
Well, he came over, he recognized von Gronau, and then von Gronau very modestly said, "Oh, listen, it's nice for an old man to be recognized at all." And I think many of us in our old age can appreciate
We surely
the
can.
same comment. And, well, we had so many interesting people who came here. Of course, I remember the German Aero Club. We had a great group from Paris Match. Paris Match, one of the most notable French magazines, and they wanted to come here and also come to Michoud in order to see some of the production at the Michoud plant. And then, of course, they would have been in New Orleans. And when they arrived here, one of them, the leader in the group, was the mayor of Paris.
Oh, really?
And also, he had been the governor of Argentina before.
Oh, really?
No, not of Argentina. What is it? Algeria.
Algeria, all right.
Which was French territory.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
that makes more sense. Yeah.
Well, we had, and they had, of course, a film crew and all their writers, and then they had a group of aviation specialists who were very interested in it. Well, it was at that time in Huntsville that Huntsville was still a dry state. And we had the people were lodged in the Albert Pick Hotel on Memorial Parkway. And of course I felt, well, you can't let a group of such
Frenchmen, no.
high-ranking
Particularly
French people,
Frenchmen.
yeah, without a drink. So I, at that time, since my French was pretty good since I had been in Paris, I was a member of the French club here in Huntsville. And so I took it upon myself to arrange a little party at 6 houses in Huntsville. There were a group of about 90 people who were there. And I had some, for example, one in the house of Fred Ordway,
Yes.
who spoke well French.
Yes.
Then in some others, but also in some of the houses of some native Huntsvillians, like Martha Rembo,
Sims.
Martha Patterson Sims
Rembo, yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
And of course, and we had buses arranged for them to take them to the various places, and they were absolutely charmed by Southern hospitality and the civility of people here.
Yes.
So
Very good.
not only were they much impressed by the tour of the Space Center, Von Braun talked to them at the Albert Pick Hotel because he had to leave to go to Washington. But I have some pictures of that meeting at the Albert Pick Hotel, and I was delighted that after the group returned to France, that their articles in Paris Match were very enthusiastic and very supportive, of course, of this idea of building large rockets and trying to get not only into space but to the moon.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Well, that was quite an experience, and it's a compliment to Huntsville that it went so well when you took them around to the different houses.
Well, I think Huntsville really has great charm in having combined a tremendous tradition with the progress that so many, in the beginning really, some of the German scientists brought here to Huntsville.
Yeah.
And they have always recognized that. I think we can be very grateful for their recognition of the activities at the Marshall Center. And, remember...
Well, all the cultural things they did too, like
Exactly.
helped start the symphony. Werner Kurz was the first concert master. You were on the board, I think, for a while, and lots of cultural contributions the group made to Huntsville.
Yeah, in addition, to the technical,
yes.
to the technology. Well, and of course, one time, as we all know, Huntsville was called Rocket City, USA.
Yes.
And everyone was so enthusiastic.
One of the things that Huntsville has got to start thinking about, you should think about it too. In 2019 will be the 50th anniversary of the first lunar landing. And that's going to be a big celebration in the United States and as well as in Huntsville. So,
Well, I don't know whether I'll make it.
well, I don't know whether I will either, but we can think about it.
Well, it's good to have something to look forward to.
It surely is. Well, your career went on beyond when Werner left Huntsville, did it not?
Yeah, it did. But let me also mention, of course, one of the highlights of my activities was being at the Cape for the launch of Apollo 11, the very first launch
Oh, you were at the Cape.
of the
Good for you.
astronauts to the moon.
I did not know that.
And actually, in the morning of that launch, I was in a helicopter with von Brown and Cornelius Ryan, the famous writer,
Yeah.
who was assigned by NASA to accompany von Braun to all the activities that he would have on that particular day.
Oh, really?
And we flew, and I remember at 4:30 in the morning, it was still dark, a helicopter was behind the Holiday Inn, and we got that helicopter, and we were in the air. We saw the Saturn Apollo vehicle on the launch side
With all the lights.
with all the lights. I mean, it was like a huge star, and it was almost overwhelming to see that. And then we flew to the Melbourne airport, and von Braun had agreed to greet the European VIPs, among Sergeant Schreiber was the American ambassador in France. He was among them, and then a lot of fascinating people. And after greeting them and having breakfast with them, he departed with a helicopter and Cornelius Ryan to the launch, what was the room where they had the start, at the Cape.
At the Cape, yeah.
Yeah. And I had the assignment to take the visitor in buses to the launch side, and they had a special area assigned for us.
Surely.
But, the strange thing, of course, it was exciting and exhilarating when finally, after the countdown, the huge vehicle rose up and you heard the roar of the engines. I mean, it really vibrated in your body. And then, of course, after a few minutes, it was gone.
Yes.
I always thought some of the tests here, some of the static tests, were almost more impressive because you had this roar of the engines for 2, 3, or 5 minutes
Yes.
even.
Yes.
So while doing a launch, the noise and everything disappeared so very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, after the launch, the aircraft took us to the Manned Spacecraft Center because after the launch was completed, the activities on the Marshall Center team was actually also completed,
Yes.
since we were only in charge of the launch vehicle, and anything that happened with the spacecraft was really controlled by the Manned Spacecraft Center in
Yes.
Houston.
Yes.
So I flew with a group to Houston, and there the mayor of Houston was at the airport with a police escort to take us all to the very elegant Warwick Hotel, and the prominent citizens of Houston had arranged, it was the middle of July, they had arranged an indoor barbecue, and they apologized and said they were unable to come up with a proper ranking of people to be seated because there were so many distinguished persons. So everyone was free to go to a table that he liked.
Okay.
And I had the pleasure of being at the table with Jacqueline Oriol, the test pilot, the daughter of a French president, who, after a crash, had serious injuries in her face, and she had about 20 operations in New York. And after that facial operation, she looked as stunning as anyone else could possibly
Really?
be.
Is that right?
Yeah.
That's
Very
interesting.
charming person.
That's an interesting bit of history that I had not heard.
Yeah. Well, I stayed, of course, after Von Brown left, which seemed a tremendous loss here for Huntsville. And I continued in the beginning. He had made some arrangements with Eberhard Ries, his successor, that I could still continue to help him with some of the...
Well, Eberhard needed that help also.
legislation. Yes, certainly, yeah. And Eberhard also had several invitations to talk to his alma mater in Germany, etc.
Surely.
So there was plenty of things to do. But then later on, I was on the executive staff for a while, and then returned to the public affairs office, and I was in charge of the speaker's office. And that was kind of interesting because we were happy to send speakers wherever they were requested. And we were responsible for, I think, 9 of the southern states. And we also had a group that simply talked to students and went to schools, actually. But anyway, I still was at the in the public affairs office when the first space shuttle was launched, and I was again at the Foreign Press office for the second space shuttle launch. But after that, you know, I figured the space shuttle, as great as it is, it does not have the glory of a launch to the moon. I mean, it was kind of limited, although I realized
It
how
would have
important-
pleased your late husband, though, to have the
Yeah, he
pilot.
would, right. But then I thought, well, I'll retire early in order to see what life outside the Marshall Space Flight Center is. So I retired in '82, and
1 year after I did, I retired in '81.
oh really? Well, I think we had seen the highlights.
Yeah, we saw it.
We knew it couldn't get any better.
Right.
So anyway, but then I finally, at the request of my daughter, I moved away from Montesano, and I bought an old house in Huntsville, a house that was from 1833.
Really, that old?
Yeah, and it had been transferred to Eccles Avenue. And after that, I went to the university to take some courses in Alabama history.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and it was Dr. Frances Roberts who was the one who taught these courses.
Oh, how nice.
And she immediately got me to be a docent at the Whedon House. She also helped me with some of the history of that old house, and I appreciated her support. And so I got to know a good number of the native Huntsvillians, and I've enjoyed my association with them tremendously.
Well, you've had a remarkable career, both you and your husband. You carried on yourself.
Well, I have...
One has to do that.
Well, my husband died so early, so I always enjoyed being involved in activities. And I also became a docent at the Bird Museum and worked with the symphony. And I'm in a study circle that it was president at one year. And that study circle has existed for over 100 years.
Really?
But you only have 25 members because we meet in individual houses. And but I think the fact of his survival is that we're not serving anything. You don't get a glass of water or a cup of coffee. We just have a subject, and everyone in whose house a meeting is being held, he is responsible for the speaker or does his own talk. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of an interesting group. Of course, and right now, mostly the daughters of former members. And I think who got me into the group was Meg Wright. Mm-hmm. She was president of that study circle while she and her husband, who was president of UAH at that time, lived in the old house on Eccles.
Yes.
So right now I enjoy the many friends that I have here, and although my daughter lives in Munich in very comfortable circumstances, and I have been there at Christmas time, and normally I've been over there twice a year, and she has been here once or twice a year. But I really have enjoyed all my activities and friends here in Huntsville. And Huntsville is just a great place, and it is a lot more convenient for an older person to drive in Huntsville and live in Huntsville and be able to get to the symphony or get to the theater or even get to the hospital if necessary than it is in a large city like Munich. So I hope that I can enjoy a few more years of comfort here in Huntsville.
Well, that's a wonderful way to end the interview. Thank you so much for being here, and it's been a very interesting bit of history that you've shared with us. So thank you again.
Well, thank you, Pat.